Hi everyone, welcome to this virtual CASA seminar. We're very happy to have Jennifer Clark with us today. Jennifer is Professor and Head of City and Regional Planning at the Knowlton School of Architecture at Ohio State. And she is, as many of you will know, a major figure in economic geography. She has an impressive, verging on terrifying stack of books and articles under her belt. Today she's going to be talking about smart cities and in particular her recent book about the topic. So Jennifer, the floor is yours. Welcome to CASA.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to come talk to you. I was looking at the list of people you had in your lecture series for this semester, and I thought, oh, some of my favorite people. So I really appreciate being included in the group. And I hope that the way that I'm going to be talking about uneven innovation, the urban technology project today will actually fit nicely in the conversations you've been having with others through the course of the semester. So apologies in advance for any noise. Some of you may notice that while Max introduced me, it's my job to introduce this small dog over here. This is Jinx. She's generally well behaved, but that's what's happening over there. And hopefully she will be quiet for this as well. So I will try to stay within our sort of 30 minutes conversation, because for me, the thing that's really exciting and interesting for me when doing these talks is hearing your thoughts and your questions and having that engaged component of the interaction. So I'll try to leave a fair amount of time for that. And I've given the talk, like I know what I'm going to say. So this is the least interesting part for me. The most interesting is you. So, but I will get started with this, partly with kind of referring to something in social media, which is part of our whole urban technology project these days, which is a thread that Max was tweeting about earlier this week about, does anyone care about smart cities anymore? Is it dead? What happened? Do we care? And I will just refer you to the beginning of the title here, which is that really this book is about uneven innovation. And the talk is really about the urban technology project. And the way that I just sort of orient you in the way I'm going to be talking about this is that I very much look at the urban technology project as being a longer project than the smart cities project. The smart cities discourse, the smart cities project is an iteration of the urban technology project broadly writ. So that's more what we're going to be talking about today. And then the issue of uneven innovation is really what the argument that I make in this book, but also in a series of pieces of my research, is that uneven innovation is sort of the outcome of this iteration of the urban technology project. So smart cities is kind of pushing us towards further uneven innovation, which is sort of my characterization and riff off of uneven development in the urban technology project. So that's the sort of naming variables in a sense, the conceptual variables for you early on in the conversation. So you'll also, I understand that you guys are embedded in an architecture school, as I am here. So one of the things that's sort of almost required in that context for a planner / economic geographer is to have some images of buildings. So you will see that I have some. So part of the guessing game here is you can stay even more engaged by trying to figure out where some of these places are as we go through the talk. So I wanted to start just really talking about why I think it's important to reframe urban innovation and think about it in this broader, as a broader urban technology project. Part of that has to do with my orientation as sort of an economic geographer who works on urban planning, economic development topics. And in my career, I've always worked on evolving and enabling industries. And so that, starting with industries that I've worked with for a very long time, like optics and photonics, but also things like biotechnology, nanotechnology, advanced and performance materials, things like that. In many ways, what we didn't talk about when the smart cities conversation started is talking about how smart cities can be seen as an industry itself, right? That does all the things that industries do when they're trying to build their own markets and construct markets, and all the things that industries do when they try to integrate into existing incumbent systems, whether that's systems of customers or whether that's systems of, in this case, the built environment, governance structures, all of those things. So thinking about the urban technology project really as an evolving and enabling industry. And the second piece is really the argument I make about uneven innovation, which is an effort to position the urban technology project and our analysis of the smart cities discourse within it, within a question of economic geography and urban planning that's a longer historical and also territorialized conversation. One of the things that's been kind of remarkable about the smart cities discourse is it is largely ahistorical and largely deterritorialized, even though it literally has in its title a territory that is designated. And so, one of the conversations that we always have about smart cities is, whoa, what's the tech sector interested in cities for? And that's one of the really big analytical questions here is how is the tech sector using the city? How is this technology project using the city? And of course, this gets to something that's really important to urban planners and people who are involved in regional development, which is how do we think about regional differences and local variation within the context of the urban technology project when we're dealing with an industry, the tech sector, that very often isn't all that interested in local variation. Is in fact not interested in it. It is a problem for them rather than to solve, rather than what we look at it from where we stand as sort of defining what makes places distinctive and important is their localized characteristics in the communities that set the priorities for how places are different. And so that's really this fourth portion of this conversation, which is how do we return to participatory planning and community development as an important part of how the urban technology project rolls out, whether that is rolling out as smart cities per se or some additional iteration that we move forward with. Okay, so what's missing from the urban technology project? So this is sort of how I came to it as somebody who was observing and sort of a participant observer in some sense as a researcher in trying to put together urban innovation projects that were a part of the broader benefit for regional economic development purposes. And one thing that sort of struck me early on was the debate about how the urban technology project was really looking at cities as revenue streams seemed really underdeveloped. So the idea that we were looking at both, one of the things we expect industries to do is try to develop a revenue model when we're looking at cities and partnerships with cities that's often around real estate development. So extracting profits from land and then extracting profits from data also seemed to be a big part of the proposed revenue model here. But it wasn't really clear exactly, and still isn't, which is one of the reasons we see industry sort of pop in and out of projects, industry actors pop in and out of projects within the smart cities conversation, is that this is a really sort of contingent situation right now in terms of the revenue model. Also, this issue about who are we selling to? So the tech sector is very used to selling to users or consumers. That's how they define their market. When they got involved in cities, they weren't really sure whether they were selling to us as individual users or whether they were selling to cities. And then cities were supposed to develop what services or products or systems that citizens had access to. So this sort of conflation of whether are we talking about providing services to citizens through cities? Are the cities are we targeting them as the consumer, or are we trying to build something? And you see this with something like the multimodal mobility issue is, hey, who's the consumer here of the scooters? Is it the individual or is it the city, right? Also, as somebody who studies industries and economic development, the question of, okay, where's the power analysis here? Like, where's the power analysis of how we think about if cities are prototyping platforms for an industry, a nascent and emerging industry? How's that power analysis working out, right? What is the power dynamic there? And then this gets to the issue of governance, which gets discussed in some ways, which is the question around the governance, not just of individual constituent projects of the deployment of something like scooters or the deployment of particular processes and systems, but also the issue of how is the overall project of these urban technology, these projects and these systems and objects actually governed, right? And is there capacity within cities that have been largely hollowed out in terms of administrative capacity? Do they even know how to do this, right? And do they want to be doing this? And then the issue that is very sort of central in my broader my broader project, which is the issue of work, which is the issue of how the changes that the Smart Cities Project is making to cities as platforms for work. How is that changing? How is that changing how work is organized? So contingent labor, precarious work, gig work, co-working, all of this idea where the firm sheds risk and responsibilities and costs for the provisioning of workspace to individuals and to cities to provide on their own. And then there's a second layer of the work conversation, which is the actual level of expertise and effort it takes to administrate the deployment of urban technology projects and the kind of ICT upgrading that actually has to happen to make cities be this sort of smart city that sort of industry talks about. So this involved me sort of moving beyond tracking smart cities interventions and taking a much more thematic approach to the question of what was happening through this iteration of the Urban Technology Project. And one of those was really broadly understanding this idea of technocratic solutions to urban policy challenges as not just being something we walked into today, but something we have a long history within urban planning. And within that is this kind of solution-based discourse, right? There's a problem of cities and we've got the tech solution to solve it. That conversation has been a fight within urban planning for a long time, and we might learn something by looking back at how that conversation has evolved and the analytical tools that we have around it. Similarly, this issue that smart cities is really this market-making question. We're talking about an emerging market that's trying to sell new and upgraded products to a set of customers, broadly writ, right? What do we know about actors in emerging markets and how they try to construct spaces for their technologies? What do we know about urban entrepreneurship and urban entrepreneurialism? And what do we know about what happens when cities are put into a situation where they're trying really to sell themselves in a global economy by being able to name what their capacity, by essentially adopting technologies that may or may not be tailored to their needs in any particular way? So we also have this issue of exacerbating place, right? This idea of one of the things that's very clear within the discourse around uneven development, which we know very well from the economic development literature, is this idea that the exploitation of uneven development is part of the revenue model, right? So is the exploitation and the exacerbation of uneven innovation part of the strategy of smart cities? This is a question to be asked and part of the themes to be pulled apart. Also, this issue of if we don't have an existing governance structure right now that seems to be very robustly governing what's going on in terms of the deployment of these processes, then what is the governance system? And there is an alternative governance system, which really is about these networks of policy diffusion, right? And that's something to keep in mind, the sort of diffusion of particular kinds of systems and objects. Forgetting my third one. Objects and systems to services to different places without actually going through a policy evaluation process. And then the sort of sixth piece that I thought was thematically really important is this idea of, okay, we know these technologies actually can increase civic engagement, can push open innovation. How do we get there from here, even with these constraints that are put in the way in the way it's currently being rolled out? So I looked at, this is the book and the title of the 2020 book, and it really revolves around these 5 premises which you can see sort of dovetail with those themes. So the idea that uneven innovation is both where we have been and where we are going. We shouldn't be sort of thinking of smart cities or the Urban Technology Project as something that we don't know how to handle and we don't know how to analyze. We can do this, right? Its novelty is not really that novel. Also, this understanding that the tech sector, it needs the city as a source of subsidy and risk reduction. So it is indeed exploiting uneven innovation and maintaining it. We see cities do this. We see industries do this with places, with regions all the time. And this is, again, something we know how to analyze and think about. The issue about the policy diffusion pattern. This is really, for those of you who've read Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore's book, Fast Policy, about the devolution of policy mobilities and how they sort of circumvent traditional models of policy transfer. That's what we're seeing in the Smart Cities project with things like 100 Resilient Cities and the Bloomberg Innovation Delivery teams, and the kind of convenings that have been very typical, both sponsored by nonprofits and networked organizations, but also by firms and networks of firms. Then there's this issue on the work issue that the smart cities is really exacerbating and amplifying precarious work, and sort of centering, as we would say, a precarious work, and embedding labor flexibility into the production and operations of the built environment. And this is one that's going to require, I think, a lot more work by a lot of us to unpack and sort of demonstrate and particularly think about sort of the local regulatory responses to that. And then finally, and I think this is the data point, which data point, which is I think partly something that some of your other speakers have been talking about, which is that very much in an important ways, data are the product of the Smart Cities project, but the revenue model is under construction. It's not clear how much the data is valuable and how to use it yet. So it is part of, it falls through, it exists throughout the production process from innovation all the way to consumption. And it's not clear exactly how all that's going to work out. So one of the things that I think it's really important for economic geography and economic development purposes is understanding that what this tech sector project has really done to cities is it's created this unspecified technology specialization for places. So instead of having cities with specific industrial specialization, somebody's good at autos, somebody's good at software, somebody's good at rubber, instead what we've got is every city is sort of tech city, is good at tech. And really the Amazon headquarters competition very much underscored this reality, which is competition with against cities within the global economy based on your tech capacity. You're not something that's differentiated, and that changes the game in some pretty significant ways. So when I say constructing smart cities markets, I'm talking about the design, deployment, and development of an emerging class of cross-platform service integrated technology products intended to enhance performance or create a data-enabled and integrated platform for prototype development. So it's really important to keep in mind that part of the function of the territory of the city and the Smart Cities project is as a platform for prototype development. So it is not only the space where the products are consumed, it is the place where they are designed and developed as well. So the city is important throughout the production process for the tech sector, which goes back to our power analysis. So stay tuned. The other thing to keep in mind is that the issue of cross-platform and service integrated, we're really looking at service integrated products. So not just distinct sales of some, and this is a very 21st century sort of economy sort of conversation, but it's the service contract, it's the wireless contract, it's all the other sort of consistent revenue streams in addition to the object itself that are why this is such a robust space for industry to take to look at. So you think about how much your iPhone costs beyond the purchase of the iPhone. You think about putting the public sector on the hook for that, times, whatever order of magnitude you want to say. That's part of what was so attractive about cities as markets for the tech sector, right? As opposed to having individual users just as the market for this. So then we get to this issue, and you guys are talking about the defunct Sidewalk Labs. So I'll give you this one in Toronto map here. And this is really important to keep in mind, is that what we're seeing is partly this tension around managerialism and entrepreneurialism within the idea of what cities are supposed to be doing or what cities want to do, particularly as they're sort of hollowed out in terms of capacity. When we think about neoliberalism and outsourcing and all of these things, do cities have the capacity to think strategically and manage strategically when on the other side of the negotiating table is something like Google? right? So this is a very, this is a power asymmetries conversation here too. And this issue about the tech, tech as a substitutable specialization across many different places, many different cities, rather than just competing against the 2 or 3 other cities that are good at biotech, right? So that gets to this question of what kind of platforms are cities becoming for this particular industry. And then finally, this issue of alternative paths for the urban technology project, where we can see something more like a bottom-up approach to the technology rather than a top-down approach. So a market-making approach, sort of, maybe there's another way to do this. Maybe work has something, maybe thinking about work can actually help us get there, right? So when we analyze emerging industries and enabling industries, when we think about what their market making is, what we want to do is we want to think about the products that are on the table. We want to think about the actors who are involved. We want to think about the processes by which the sort of diffusion of that technology is happening. And then we want to think about the geographies of implementation as well, right? So again, back to the point about we know how to do this, right? We have tools of how we look at industries when they get into a diffusion mode and they're looking to diffuse into, in this case, the public sector, right, into a particular sort of level of the public sector. If we were looking at, say, how additive manufacturing wanted to move into let's say, into the auto industry, we would also ask, what particular products are we looking at? Who are the actors involved in doing this? What are the processes by which this is happening? And where are the geographies of implementation of this and what's necessary there? So here, it's really important to understand that it's a whole set of products. It's not just one set of products that are involved. And so when we look at deployment projects, it can be very confusing because some of them are actually systems projects, some of them are platforms, some of them are big, some of them are tiny, tiny, discrete. You think about like big belly trash cans, that is an object, right? It is a service embedded object, and then it often has Wi-Fi and other things, but it's not part of a broader system. It wants to be part of the broader sort of trash, garbage management system, but very often it really isn't tied up to that. And a lot of these things, as they go through deployment, they are not enabled to their full capacity in the initial deployment too. So they're seen as possibly being part of a system or a platform in some future iteration, but aren't right now, right? And that has been part of the issue of rolling this out, is what does incremental implementation look like for smart cities? The actors involved, we have the public sector involved, we have the private sector involved, and we have this very interesting set of philanthropic actors and civic intermediaries who have created these partnerships and networks that are also really involved in this project. And that's a little distinct from just trade associations or other kinds of sort of intermediaries. So it's really important to understand the civic intermediaries, and I'm not totally happy with calling them civic intermediaries, but you get the sense of who I'm talking about and who these players are. In terms of processes, I do think that this does look a lot like how regional innovation systems and national innovation systems have sort of rolled things out in other contexts. So it's not super unfamiliar in that sense. There are some the thing that's really interesting to me about this is that there's so little space for small firms. So little space for small firms in the Smart Cities project, and we can talk about that in greater detail later. And then, of course, the geographies of implementation here are very much reliant on these test bed approaches. So we get, from the get-go, we get uneven innovation because the way that the implementation has been incrementalized is by testbed implementation, which, when we're talking about whether we're providing services to citizens, is a highly problematic approach, right? Particularly if we're doubling down on one place after another about different product deployments, but in the same testbed space, right? So here we have two testbed spaces, for example. These are, and this reminds us that really what we've seen as the strategy that the tech sector has adopted is sort of a real estate plus data extraction. So, and this gets woven into a conversation about how you get consumption to happen. So spatializing consumption within these sort of authentic real estate developments, right? So places where people want to go and spend money, and then we can track them with data. And while we're doing that and trying to figure out what the actual smart cities user experience is going to be, what the products and services are going to be, we've got this real estate development that's allowing us to actually have a revenue model that works while we figure out the prototyping and the product development around it, right? That was the game with Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. That was a larger scale use of that than these smaller scale sort of tested approaches. The top one being Ponce City Market in Atlanta, the bottom one being Chelsea Market in New York City. They look a lot alike because they're both redevelopment projects done by Jamestown, which is a German company. So, this is actually a part of, it's important to understand this as part of real estate strategy, but also about urban consumption strategies. So going on to looking at how the Amazon headquarters project actually helped us understand this, took a big highlighter to this whole story about the how authenticity plays into this too. So there's a lot of different layers to understanding this analysis. One of the, I recently did a review of Sharon Zukin's new book, The Innovation Complex, and I would just suggest if anybody, like, if you're the kind of person who needs, like, really likes to have it tactile, like tied down the examples, this book is great for using New York City as a set of very clear examples of how a lot of these the themes I'm describing, the processes that I'm describing actually play out in real space. So I recommend that highly. Particularly things like how the authenticity, or what we call the San Franciscoization of urban places, this idea of almost undifferentiated authenticity, which sounds like an oxymoron, but if you, once we can travel again, you can keep an eye out for it and you'll see it, right? And the Amazon H2 headquarters competition really took this to a different level about the undifferentiation issue by asking places to make the argument that they could all do the same thing equally well. So made them compete on this. And instead of what we think of as having places have some sort of labor market specialization, some sort of cultural distinction. So in many ways, what we're seeing is this sort of convergence towards one sort of tech identity, and and from multiple directions, the sort of ask of places that they do that they work towards that. So places as platforms for whom, like, how are we, what is the point of all of this? And this continues to be a question that ties back, again, there's a historical context to this, thinking about struggling with the creative class, thinking about this conversation as emerging from a conversation that we've had in economic geography previous to this, that helps us understand, like, wait a second, do we need to have a little bit more clarity on why we're doing this and why this is happening, for whom is it happening, and who is left out, right? Also, there's this sort of, there's the beginnings of I don't want to say optimism, but it's almost optimism that communities are able to push back in an effective way against these alliances between cities and the tech sector to make some of these investments that may not be in line with what communities want, right? So between the resistance in New York City to Amazon headquarters, and then the resistance of Toronto to Sidewalk Labs, I think it's worth keeping in mind that those are two places that have really sophisticated histories with community development. They are two places where this was not their first rodeo in terms of speaking to their civic leaders and saying, this is not how we want this to go. For smaller places, for places that have less established histories with community development and community organizing, I don't think we should expect that they're going to have the same success with pushback. And it's worth observing that thinking about how we're going to build participatory practices into this may be something we need to get on top of pretty quickly, or we may get much further down this road. than some places really want to do. And this goes to the histories of community economic development practice are a good place for us to look for models of how to do this. This is one of the things I bring up in the book is how there really are some good models of participatory practices, but also binding participatory practices that we can look at as ways to, instead of sort of looking at digital civics or civic tech as the way to solve this problem, we might look at what we already have in terms of participatory processes and basically breathe new life into them and add urban innovation techniques to them rather than develop a parallel system. And then for neighborhoods, this is really a question about how we identify these sort of reverse bidding and race to the bottom practices and call them what they are instead of having them sort of sneak up on us. And then I don't want to leave you without talking a little bit about why the work piece is important. Again, this really is about how we're changing these workspaces. We're basically, in many ways, and the COVID experience has done this in a very particular way, has sort of highlighted how important it is to have that urban infrastructure in place, technology infrastructure in place for people to be able to work, but also learn. So it used to be we were having this conversation about Uber drivers and gig work and whether we had, sufficient, 5G for the autonomous vehicles to be deployed. Now we're talking about whether there's sufficient infrastructure for K through 12 kids to actually be able to learn during a pandemic and still go to school, right? So this issue of whether the ICT infrastructure is evenly distributed, the problem we have to solve is not that we don't want to be driving our cars. The problem that we need to solve is that learning needs to be something that's accessible to everybody who needs it, right? So this is really changing this question of how we understand the city as a platform for work. And then the second piece of the work discourse that I have is really this issue of we need to take seriously that, and I say this partly as somebody who trains urban planners, right? It's like, it's work to do this. Urban innovation takes specialized work. And if we just look at the data question, which I know is something that some of my colleagues in this series talked to you about, is the data takes a lot of work. Like, it's domain specific strategic iterative work. It's not something you can just throw into a hackathon over the weekend and buy kids pizza. Like, there is actually work and specialized work involved here. There's domain knowledge, the documentation is work, and the entire process of actually skilling people up to be able to do this work within the public sector is also a really important part of the story too. So I won't belabor that, but it's this upgrading of sort of the skills and thinking seriously about what it's going to take, what we need to add to our cities and the administration of our cities in order to be responsive, to be at the other side of the table when we make these investments, right? So are there alternative futures to this project? Yes, there is a way forward here. And one of them really is to think about whether we want to return to managerialism, right? Do we just want cities to be providing these services, or do we want cities to be sort of economic development engines, and we want the strategies around the partnership with the Urban Technology Project to be part of that economic development, that regional economic development strategy? If that's what we want, then we need to think about how we want to do that. And part of that might be something about like, hey, is this really about jobs here? Like, are we looking at transnational corporations who are extracting data from our city and making it impossible for us to have any small firms develop an innovation network here? Like, sorry. So that's one of the questions to ask. And if indeed what the answer is like, no, we'd like to use this for economic development purposes, then the question is, what's the participatory process for developing an urban entrepreneurialism approach that actually defines goals and vision from the bottom up rather than from the top down? And of course, I think that part of that strategy really involves writing work back into the story on both of those levels. And we see some of this happening, whether it's through labor regulation or data regulation, or by simply starting to think about how we want to push back a bit about how work seems to have been very quickly reorganized in a way that perhaps is not quite as beneficial to the individual workers or to the city. This also has to do with questions about if the risk and the cost of providing workspaces now is not borne by the firm, but is now borne by the city and the individual. Perhaps some of the ways that we were allocating costs and who we were billing for what needs to change a little bit too. And so finally, I just leave you with a concern that I have, which is this issue of sort of obscuring the question of difference. That one of the amazing things about cities is really that they are places where we can see participation, variation, and change. And when we look at the tech sector, what we often see is the tech sector try to obscure that, try to make places look more the same and less different. And that makes it very difficult for places to be places. And so in many ways, what we have to do is embrace this idea that the local is not actually the enemy here. What we would like to see, I think I would like to see, is urban innovation provide for the levels of increased participation, accept variation, and really lead us through forms of change and transformation that align with the priorities and interests of individual communities affected. And with that, I will stop and look forward to your questions.
Jennifer, thank you so much for that. That was really eye-opening stuff, I think. There's a huge amount in there as well. I have like dozens of notes and questions written down. I was really struck by this notion of the urban technology project, which really broadens out smart cities from this set of delineated kind of energy and transport spaces and links it to the platform economy and links it to urban real estate development. I think that's a very powerful and useful way of framing it for our students and for other people in the audience. So questions are already coming into the chat, quite a lot of them. Let me abuse chair's privilege to sort of ask you the first one, which is, just to come back to this, this point we made at the beginning. It looks as if, according to the article I was tweeting about, the number of kind of government-run smart city projects the wave has crested and they're kind of dropping away. So, do you believe that? And if so, what do you think is going on? I mean, is it that the smart cities are dead, or is it this that we're not talking about it? And actually, we need to talk about it in terms of this broader urban technology project that you were running us through.
It's interesting. So in the European context, there always were more smart cities projects that were either the pilot funding was public sector funding in the sense of one level or another of the public sector. And in the US context, it was much more industry driven, the individual projects, and it was really sort of the cities were sort of the compliant partner. Like the accepting partner, like you can use my territory to deploy your technology and hopefully nothing bad will happen, was kind of the more of the approach in the US. There were a couple of exceptions to that. And one of them is where I'm sitting, which is there was the only really big federal money that came to specifically smart cities during this period was through a US DOT Department of Transportation project that was 78 cities competed for it, and in Columbus, Ohio, where I am now, it is the city that actually got those resources. So in terms of whether, so that's my first, there's a lot of national variation going on and supra-regional variation going on about who was funding it and to what purpose. The question of whether or not the public sector is pulling back, I do think that there is a sense that some of the initial sort of marketing around this, which I do think compelled some policymakers, things like the competition for autonomous vehicles, the idea that autonomous vehicles, that there could be public transportation applications of autonomous vehicles. Some of this stuff doesn't look so compelling anymore, particularly once you sort of unpack the numerous layers of infrastructure of ICT, but also physical and urban design infrastructure that's actually the prerequisite for some of these things to happen. So I think that what's really happened is sort of a pause on the question of how does incremental implementation look in smart cities, in the smart cities context, in the urban technology project? Do we really just have to start with a big infrastructure project where we actually get on the ICT side of this and do some real serious urban design reconfiguring, right? That's a different question. That's an infrastructure question, as opposed to these, like, I can, put out a bunch of benches that you can plug your iPhone into and recharge, right? And I think that's part of what we're seeing is what's the revenue model there? Like, and the public sector has a different role. If it's an infrastructure project, we're talking about different dollars or different euros.
Sure. Thank you. That's really helpful. So look, there's a couple of questions from the floor. I'm going to start with one from Nathaniel, who's asking. He has two questions actually, so I'm going to pick one. His first question is about how you sort of mobilize communities and the general public to voice their issues on what he calls sort of tech and smart city test sites. So I guess you've given some examples of that, but can you say a little bit more about, some of the kind of processes and actions that might happen there?
Okay, I'm trying to understand the question. How to mobilize communities and the general public to voice their issues. Yeah, so this goes back to part of what I was saying about it really helps if you already have this sort of practice as part of your community's sort of embedded knowledge, right? So for places that are not used to mobilizing, the question is sort of, do we need playbooks? So the civic tech community does do this, where they develop in sort of digital civics people who tend to come out of human computer interaction, colleges of computing, that sort of thing. They don't tend to come out of urban planning or community development practice. So I guess this is my caveat to say, like, you see civic computing people come up with playbooks, which are sort of ways for communities to think about and engage the technology, and to some extent get the prototypes tailored to their needs a little bit more. So it's very much on the user the idea that you, community member, so you that's the unit of analysis, the user, can be an informant to the person developing the technology so that it's better tailored to your needs. That's not the same thing as resisting the project, right? That's not the same thing as organizing for resistance. So I think that that's part of the question here, is the question of, how do we take, and I talk about this a bit in the book, is how do we take what's working well from the civic tech, from the digital civics folks, which is a deep understanding of the prototyping and the development of the technologies and how user needs do interface with that. How do we take that and also take what we know about community mobilization and pull those things together in order to sort of upgrade community mobilization for this technology space? And that's kind of what I would say, is I think that this is a big project. And I really would like to see, I think it's one of the things that could breathe more new life into sort of community development practice as a subfield of urban planning, is getting a handle around this technology component.
I mean, is this where you also link it up to your piece about regulation? So, I mean, a lot of the action we're talking about is kind of basically local action, but what's been very striking with these recent set of decisions on Uber is that they're kind of state level, either kind of national state or US state. So is this another sort of part of the policy response that needs to be considered together with it?
Yeah, I think part of the policy response, and you do see this, and I'm sorry, I haven't been to the UK in a little while. Usually I'm there more often, so I have a little more sense from watching the news what's going on. But in the US context, this really has started to devolve down to state and to city level, but not just in the regulation of tech, in the regulation of many things. So we were getting a lot of variation in terms of regulatory environments at the state and local level, and particularly for the big cities that have serious economies. Like, I mean, your San Francisco's, your Seattle's, your and New York, where you're starting to see places say, like, no, not here. So you're starting to see an understanding that the power dynamic is such that you don't have to just. So it used to be that the vendors. I love that one of my colleagues who's in the Boston urban mechanics group. It gets quoted a lot, and he always talks about them as the vendors, which I love because it's sort of like it sort of takes down the industry down a peg. But he talks about how the vendors will come in and they're like, we'll deploy this for free for you if you let us. But if you wait, like if you don't let us do it now and we get 2 other cities to let us do it and it turns out that everybody wants it, we're selling it to you next time. We'll come back. Next time you see us, it's going to cost you money. But if you do it now, you get to be on the front end and we'll do it for free, right? So there was a lot of this, like, really kind of nasty bargaining stuff that happened in the first round. I think most cities have gotten to the point at this point that they are not falling for that at the same. And I think this is probably one of the things that's slowing down some of these vendor-driven deployments.
So that brings in a second question from Philip Wilkinson, who's at CASA, about Amazon HQ2. So Philip's cynical speculation about it is, how much do you think the competition between places was essentially a kind of fishing expedition for Amazon as a way of kind of getting information about the tech talent and real estate potential of these locations, as well as a competition for a site? I mean, I've seen people at Brookings making that argument, so I'd be very interested to know what you think Amazon's sort of strategy or strategies were there.
Yeah, it was actually if I were on the Amazon side of it, I would say this was a super smart. I mean, deeply cynical, but a very smart move, because that is one of the things that they got out of the competition is they got a huge amount of detailed information for free about the market. So this is their market, and this is the other thing, is that the density issue for many of these technology firms, high density environments are the best environments for them to both sell, right, but also extract data, right? They need the density. They don't care about, there's nothing they can learn that's useful about tracking people around, rural Nebraska. So what they want is they really need to be able to figure out with specificity the markets in various places so that they can just aggregate and average that, right? and that's effectively what this let them do. At the same time, what it did is it allowed them to sort of you throw something into the room and you see how everybody reacts. They basically got all at once, they threw what do we call it in science, where you stimulate the system and you see how the system reacts. That's what they got cities to do, is that they actually injected a stimulus and then they watched and saw what everybody's reaction was. The amount of pushback to being asked to compete in basically some sort of reverse bidding thing was almost nil, right? And so this is, I think, part of why they did it. They didn't need this as the way to set up a second headquarters, and they have set up the second headquarters without the output, without this. Like, they already have huge floors and floors upon floors of buildings where people are all over the place. They didn't need to do this except for the experiment, right? And so, yeah, no, I don't entirely agree with my colleagues at Brookings for a couple of reasons. But I do agree that this was a very strategic and largely in a very cynical move.
Absolutely. So there's another question in the chat, which is something that I was thinking about as well, which is this point you made kind of almost in passing about how there's not much space for small firms in in this setting. And so HBJ would like to hear a bit more about that. I mean, so, is this just that there are network effects and they're kind of played out, so there's no space for small firms to come in, or is something else going on? So, I mean, the questioner is asking specifically about whether there are, kind of government policy tools that might kind of rebalance the setting a bit. So it would be great to have your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I actually think that this is one of the real where we need to spend some time. I mean, and when I say we, I mean like those of us who put our brains on these questions. And I certainly don't have the end of this answer here, but I do think it's really interesting, the contrast what's going on in sort of urban innovation and other kinds of innovation projects, right? So we think very much when we think about sort of regional innovation systems, we think very much about the question of how do we create firm networks, small firm networks, small and medium-sized enterprises, because those are the ones that are sort of the localized, they're the ones that'll stay in place. They're the ones that where you sort of retain value and wealth, right? And help you build wealth and specialization over time. So this eradication of the question of specialization, of specialized specialization, falls into this category. The tech sector has always been sort of a big absorber. They don't like small firms. And they tend to very quickly absorb anybody who has a competition. So barriers to entry are high in the tech sector because of all the underlying platform requirements, right? And so this is one of the reasons you saw so many sort of firm alliances being put together at the beginning of the Smart Cities project, where a hardware provider, a software provider, and a connectivity provider, and then a couple of other, like a business analytics provider or data analytics provider, would all decide that they were going to create an alliance themselves, right? We're in Siemens network, or this is Cisco's network, right? And the network was the team of providers, right? And that made it very hard for small firms to get into the game. And it was intended, right? And of course, you also have this issue with small firms, which is when small firms, small vendors go to the public sector and say, we've got this great tool, would you like to use it? The public sector says, no, we'd like to use something reliable. Who are you? We've never heard of you. And this doesn't have to happen this way, right? If you think about like Industry Canada, if you think about a lot of larger, more established sort of innovation teams in other spaces, they intentionally allocate some portion of their procurement to small firms or to local firms, right? That's not what's happened here. And it would be a very simple thing for a city to say, we're going to allocate some of our, X amount of our procurement to firms that are actually doing business here, right? And some of them informally have tried to do this, and then they get absorbed by Google or Amazon or whatever. So I think the intentionality around this needs to be better developed, to think about how to really create capacity, create specialization, create wealth for the places that are being used as platforms, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this example of kind of local procurement is something that's been tried kind of experimentally here. So Preston is a city that is the most well known for it, but I know that Greater Manchester has tried exactly the kind of tool that you've been talking about as well. I mean, these are cities that have the capacity to do that. It's obviously not straightforward to go back through the supply chain and stuff, but yeah, that's really useful. Thank you. So Mark has a comment in the chat. As he says, more of a thought than a question. But if I can gloss it, Mark, so forgive me. I think he's, asking about, what you think about the kind of city governance and city democracy and how smart elements are changing that. I mean, Mark, if you want to kind of come in and put it more succinctly than that, please unmute and.
No, that's fine, Max. As usual, I took a long-winded, verbose approach to it. It's just about, are we looking at multiple overlapping form of power dynamics going on, and also question the role of universities for cities that have universities and R&D components, where the rules of our funding explicitly expect us to work with corporates as well on science and tech innovation. And so we have those dynamics. Municipalities having dynamics with corporations, or at least are being bombarded by requests from corporates. And then you have the digital tech creative communities, which are very much homegrown and bottom up, and fighting to have access to civ tech opportunities here. And what seems to be happening is that municipal governments are really struggling to find the right rules and tools to be able to manage that process, if you think it should be managed at all, and that's debatable. But they're using tools like procurement and issues to do with accountability and legitimacy and ownership, which are ill-suited to the process. So out of that, issues about what style of democracy, not just the style of the city, but the style of democracy and the style of governance caused by smart innovations are having a whole shadow effect over the nature of how you manage cities, completely.
Yeah, I think this is actually a huge part of where things have gotten sort of, I'm not sure if I know, just really sort of tied up here. And part of it is the issue the universities are not we would say the disinterested third parties that we might think that they could be, right? So if you think about it as some sort of triadic operation, right, there would be the public, the city, the university, and the industry somehow, sort of being, and the university clearly having the capacity to sort of evaluate the technology being brought forward and be able to talk about, whether and evaluate whether or not it's actually can do what it's supposed to do. We have the same issue in the US, which was that the cities kept bringing to us the tech that was being brought to them by the vendors and saying, please tell us whether these people are telling the truth about what this is. I'm being flipped, but I mean, essentially it was like, help us think about this. We don't know how to think about this. And the measures and the processes that they had to deal with it were largely through the contractual relationships they had with how they were doing outsourcing, right? So, we're looking at and again, this is what I think is really important to position this within the last sort of 40 years of outsourcing and public administration changes, because what you've got is you've got the tool of saying like, okay, we're going to subcontract with these folks. Who owns the data in that arrangement, right? And do I care about who owns the data? And, do I care about ownership or do I care about use rights to that data? Like, and what is it? Am I in a position to actually sell my citizens' data and to, let somebody else extract data from my citizens and then they own it and I can't even look at it. And the only reason that they got that data is because me as the city, I let this subcontractor come into my city and provide a service. Like, these questions are not not answered, right? They are really hanging out there and my own view about it is that we need to get far more creative about thinking about how we want to do this. So much more, and when I say creative, I don't mean like sneaking around, not following the rules. I mean, like, we need a new set of rules. We need to start thinking about being very clear about what different agendas are operating, and then figure out clear and distinct processes that actually manage those shared agendas, but also oppositional agendas. So, I'm hopeful that in part the conflict around data is going to call the question on this, because people are starting to get very concerned about the data, on the security issues, on the safety issues, and the privacy issues. It looks like that may be sort of the thin edge of what's going to come forward in terms of renegotiating this. I'm not sure it's going to be on, a more, I guess, nuanced conversation about neoliberalism and whether or not we should be subcontracting, services or not. I don't know if that conversation or whether those should be internalized within the city because they are truly public functions, right? So, I'd be happy to have the conversation and push where needed, but I'm guessing that it's going to be on the data first.
Jennifer, thank you. We're on 6 o'clock, so I think we can finish there with the kind of vast open spaces opened up by you and Mark at the end. So a huge round of virtual applause from all of us. Thank you very much for that. Let me pause.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.